Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can.
Now you can record?
Yes, sir. Yes, yes, I can record now.
Okay, we start again. Just a minute. So we start now.
Yes, sir.
So good afternoon. My gratitude to IIT Mumbai and to Dr. Ashish Pandey, Sushma, and other staff for this interesting initiative. The idea of a workshop on yoga research online is a nice one. And during the next few minutes, I will take you on a journey of milestones in yoga research through the years, and very specially through some techniques about how we can actually do yoga research ourselves. So let me start with that. If we look back at yoga research through the years, I would like to say that the best research there ever was that undertaken by the sages and rishis of ancient India. And they used a really wonderful laboratory. And we may wonder what it was. It was their own body and their own minds. Very fortunately for us, these experiences of the ancient sages have been passed on to us with a high degree of fidelity through the years, either by their word of mouth presentations to their scholars and seekers, or by etchings on palm leaves. And because of this high fidelity in these accurate reports, we are able to test it through scientific method. And indeed, one such example through the years of testing yoga research, the philosophy, the principles, and the practice through elegant scientific experiments was Swami Kuvalananda, a very unique person and the founder of Kaivalyadam Yoga Institute in Lonavala. Swami Kuvalananda actually nicely bridged yoga philosophy and practice and medicine with a series of very interesting experiments conducted in the early 1900s. And one of such experiments, which I would like to mention, used rather state-of-the-art at that time, early 1900s, equipment, namely X-rays. What Swami Kuvalananda did was actually recorded the X-ray position of different viscera in the abdomen during a particular yoga technique, that is Udiyan Bandha, which causes considerable abdominal pressure. And it was interesting to see how the viscera readjusted themselves to that pressure. And this is just one example of many such very elegant and very forward-thinking studies done by Swami Kuvalananda very early on, which culminated in the very first yoga journal, Yoga Mimamsa, which you can see here on this slide, which was brought out in 1924 and is an active journal even today. And at that time, around the early 1900s, there was a whole lot of other research going on yoga elsewhere in the world. This was related to special powers or siddhis. In fact, way back in 1935, a French cardiologist called Thérèse Brosse actually carried with her a portable electrocardiograph, that is the equipment, brought it to India and recorded on very senior yogis who were able to stop their heart at will. And these interesting findings were published by her in 1946. Another set of studies were also done on exceptional yogis by researchers in India. These were Professor B.K. Anand, Dr. Chinna, and Dr. Baldev Singh at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. One such example is a study done on Yogi Ramananda of Hyderabad, where they looked at his claim, that is, the ability to voluntarily regulate the heart rate. Yogi Ramananda was a very exceptional person. He could also remain in an airtight pit for a certain period of time without having any discomfort. But one of the special features of research at this time, that is from the 1920s right up to 1960, was that this research was entirely related to abilities of very exceptional and special yogis who had these kind of powers, which we describe in yoga as siddhis. However, this all changed later on. There came the years of the flower children, and this began in the late 1960s with the great yoga master, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He introduced for the very first time a yoga module, a meditation module called Transcendental Meditation, just 20 minutes, which could be practiced by anyone. So even a beginner could practice this. And in very few weeks, it was seen that university students showed such dramatic changes in their brain and in the rest of their body supplied by the sympathetic nervous system. The changes were so dramatic that transcendental meditation came to be called a fourth major state of consciousness. Now, the other three states of consciousness are wakeful state, so dramatic that they got into the 1972 edition, one of the editions of Scientific American. The authors were Robert Keith Wallace, Herbert Benson, and Wilson of Harvard Medical School. What was so special about this? From then onwards, it began to be apparent that you could actually study yoga for everyone. It did not have to be a yogi, special yogi. And also that there were a vast range of applications for health, for education, for societal transformation. This was taken still further into the revolution of mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn actually started this, and now there's a real explosion of papers in this area. And on this slide, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama to explore the common features, and there are many, between Buddhist awareness and mindfulness techniques and yoga. So with this really amazing background, we can then get started on yoga research. For that, we need a research question. And this research question should be useful for as many people as possible. We cannot have a vague one, so it has to have a focus. As you will see in the next few slides, it should be very ethical and not causing any harm at all. We should be able to do it in a feasible way. It should be novel, widely applicable, reaching as many people across the world as possible and being of use to them. Logical, of course, but very, very important and often left out. It should be exciting and inspire passion and enthusiasm in us, because there are lots of drab and dull periods in research, and that's when we need the thrill and excitement of a very good and exciting, really, research question. So let's cover a bit about ethics. Before that, we'll go through hypothesis, which is a very, I don't really care too much for these terms, but a hypothesis does need to be drawn up, as does aims and objectives, where an aim is generally broad, while objectives are the steps you'll take to achieve the aim. Now we can move on to ethical considerations, a very important part of a research project. Now, how does this begin? For all of you who are very familiar with research on human subjects, you know that it all began in a very dark period of history for mankind. That was the Second World War. As the Second World War came to an end in 1945 and the concentration camps created by the Nazis were opened, a very horrifying truth came to being. That is, people began to realize that the Nazi doctors had actually operated on people in the concentration camps, which was a most atrocious form of evil. So these doctors were then tried, and that gave rise to the Nuremberg trials, which was a real turning point for human research studies. Because at this time, a formulation of ethical considerations came into being. Some of them are mentioned here, the history, which I have just covered. There are also per each country, like we have the Indian Council of Medical Research and certain guidelines given internationally by the Geneva Convention. And every institution has to have its own institutional ethical committee, which ensures each person's right to privacy and safety. Now, why is this important in yoga research? You may have a person who is very eager to show their practice, or it could be a child and the parents may be eager to show the practice. So they want to give you a video, very important nowadays when there's a lot of online presentations. It is important to remember that we have to keep each person private. So whether we are publishing a photograph of an individual or whether we want to show a video of a practice, we should not actually show the individual characteristics such as the face of the person. Every person's privacy should be respected, as well as their right to safety. So for example, you may have a person who wants to demonstrate for the purpose of research that they can remain in a posture for several minutes. Before undertaking such a study and rushing into it as a very interesting and possibly exciting research question, we should question, is it safe? So that's about, very briefly, some of the considerations we should take into account. Apart from that, is an ethical procedure to have all the data that we have taken on every person, including the raw data, the questionnaires, or wherever we have captured the data, and store it for at least 20 years in digital form, if not in hard copy. Publication ethics demands that each and every person involved in a research paper or a chapter or a book should have read all the material published there. Let's move on. Please do keep in mind the ethical considerations. Then there are a lot of procedural details. If you're doing a clinical study, which really includes anything done on patients, you have to register it in your country's registry depot. In India, this is the Clinical Trials Registry of India, CTRI, and there are also specific guidelines for subsequently considering reporting a trial in a conference, in a journal, in a book, and so on. In the same way, review articles have to be actually carried out by doing the review in a very systematic way, what we call the preferred reporting items, or systematic reviews, and meta-analysis, PRISMA. There are also other guidelines for other type of research that we may carry out. And then we come to feasibility, a very important point. These are some of the measures that we have to take into account when we devise a research project. What are the personnel that are needed? Equipment, do we have it or not, or are we requesting for it? What is the infrastructure we need? For example, the internet, the use of electricity, other things, maybe transport. Who are the participants? Is it realistic to believe that we have the sample that we expect to get? How would we get funding for during which we hope to complete the whole project? The literature review, there's a lot spoken about this. Each of these slides is a 1 week minimum talk, but I'm just going to touch on one point here. Many people who are doing your PubMed is chiefly intended to help us find or to yoga and medicine of behavioral and human interest. We should also search psychological data and education databases. So there's a lot more to be said, but as I said in the beginning, these are. Next, we come to the methods. So we see participants. The sample size, we have put this in the common arena for the last 20 years, taking into account the effect size in previous studies or a pilot study which guides the present study, which you intend to do. The power is a deciding principle, stringent and very strict. We can't formulate them as being mutually inclusive or exclusive. For example, if you say the inclusion criteria is to include children between 9 and 11 years, we cannot say the exclusion criteria is includes children less than 9 years and over 11 years. So that's redundant. Inclusion criteria should be standalone, so should exclusion criteria. We should be very clear about our method of recruitment. Is it by internet announcements? Is it by postal services and other methods? What is the source of subjects? Very important, because sometimes we find that the source falls through. What are the incentives we give? So sometimes the incentive to be part of a research project could merely be, not really merely, but it could be just the idea or excitement of being part of contributing to science in that area. Incentives can also include a tangible thing, like you may give away yoga mats or some information on yoga. and can also be monetary. We have to describe and note these details very carefully. Ethical issues I have already covered. So these are a bit about type 1 and type 2 errors. If you remember the boy who cried wolf, the story, first everyone believed that there was a wolf when there wasn't, a false positive. Next, they believed there was no wolf when there was, a false negative. Type 1 and type 2 errors. Now we come next to study design. Study designs of different types, randomization, and then we think of allocating people to two groups, blinding, where we may have the person who gives the allocation to two groups blinded, and the participant themselves blinded. So it's very difficult to imagine that a person can practice yoga and be blinded as to whether they are practicing or not. I'll give one such example of blinding the participant and of a placebo in yoga in the next slide. But there are also other designs that I'd like to talk about. A case study, which can be having its place, as I gave you the example in the beginning of Ramananda Yogi from Hyderabad. So if there's a single person who has very remarkable achievements, we may study it as a case study. A single group, very rare situations, matched control. Randomized control is the gold standard, which is usually taken up for pharmacological trials as well. Self control is a method we have pursued for the last 30 years, and cross-sectional studies can be done, but a lot of care has to be done about the confounding variables. So let's look at one example of a placebo in yoga. Dr. Virendra Singh, a doctor from Jaipur, named this device because of the place that he came from, that is the Pink City, as the Pink City Lung Exerciser. Now, if a person breathes through the Pink City Lung Exerciser, their ratio of inhale to exhale becomes 1:2. And according to Dr. Virendra Singh, this was the same as pranayama. So as a placebo, he prepared a Pink City Lung Exerciser type of device, which looked just like the Pink City Lung Exerciser, but did not change the ratio of inhale-exhale. And using this as the placebo, he did a placebo-controlled, double-blind, crossover, randomized trial, which appeared in 1990 Lancet on very mild bronchial asthma and assessing the effect of breathing through this device with that. We may really question, is it adequate to say that pranayama is just an alteration of the inhale-exhale ratio? It's much more than that, and we may miss it if we try to meet the pharmacological standards in yoga research. Let's move on. See the assessments. There are different variables and we should select them very carefully to answer our research question adequately. Addressing the validity and reliability is very important for questionnaires. And for all equipment, we need to calibrate it and check that it is accurate. Recording the laboratory environment, particularly if a person is going to practice yoga, including meditation, is very important. There are some points here. These will be taken up on by Sachin Sharma, a senior scientist. Then we come to the yoga module. It is very important to develop the yoga module with great care so that it can be very suited to answer the research question and be efficacious for that, and equally important to avoid harm. I put up a very important book, The Science of Yoga by William J. Broad. William J. Broad has published this and really created a lot of waves in the yoga world. Now, he is actually a practitioner of Iyengar yoga for many years and also a New York Times correspondent. For the very first time, he highlighted the risks of yoga, not because he wanted to detract from the benefits, but because he wanted to make it even more popular in an academic and scientific way. So we should all remember that when we talk about the risks, precautions, contraindications of yoga, we are actually contributing to the science. When we talk about yoga module, then we should make it clear about the duration, the frequency, the sequence, how people adhere to it, whether they're in qualitative reports say that they are practicing properly or not. Data extraction, How will we do it? Blinding, so the person who's extracting the data should be blind as to whether the person is blinded as to whether the person belongs to a yoga or other intervention or control group, and so on. And I would like to spend a few seconds on artifact. Artifact or noise, we see here one such example. A person has nice EEG, then moves, and there's a drastic shift in the EEG with a lot of noise. Now, a little bit on EEG and evoked potentials would be taken up by Deepak Chetri from our research foundation, who is doing his PhD in this topic. Data analysis should be done after selecting the software properly, selecting our measures of central tendency, mean, median, mode, whichever we choose, measures of dispersion, like standard deviation, the standard error of the mean, and so on. Then deciding between parametric and non-parametric tests, and when to use a test for comparison, two groups with either, say, the t-test of different types, or Mann-Whitney or Wilcoxon, multiple groups with different types of analysis of variance and analysis of covariance, correlations through Spearman correlation test or Pearson correlation test, and the type of regression analysis we use for predictions. And then we move on to the very last part, which is very exciting. We have all the data in hand, we've completed a project, and now we are ready to report it. There are at least 5 possible avenues: institutional reports, conference presentations, which could be in the form of a poster, an oral presentation, and so on, publications in journals, chapters in books and monographs, and even bringing out an authoritative book or edited book. Now, all these 5 and even more types of reports are very important, and it is the duty of each researcher to see that their research gets out into the mainstream and to the common man through proper reporting in the avenue which is most suited to the study that they have done. Thank you.